Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. You know, at the outset of the pandemic, there were a number of very young adults that graduated out of foster care during the pandemic. And of course, in the first summer of the pandemic, there was no employment because the economy was effectively shut down for public health reasons. And normally, where kids graduating in foster care would go if they didn't have employment was to apply for social insurance with the provincial government or social assistance. The government in Manitoba told them that they wouldn't even entertain their application unless they had applied for every other possible source of revenue. And of course, at that time, CERB had just been made available. The provincial government gave those kids the link, said go and apply. The provincial government knew full well that it was a no-fail application process. Those kids did what the government told them to do. They applied for the CERB benefit. They started receiving CERB. They weren't eligible for social assistance. And then much later, they were told by the federal government, you're not eligible for social assistance and you have to pay all the money back. Of course, the provincial government wasn't going to give them back pay on the social assistance that they otherwise would have been entitled to. These are some of the people now that are struggling to pay back that CERB debt. And to insist on those kids paying that debt back to the federal government is just a surefire way to undermine them as they try and get a start in life after a difficult childhood. Now, the federal government says they're going to deal compassionately with these cases on a case-by-case approach, but actually the evidence is that a lot of people are getting the bills in the mail. They're having a hard time getting through to the CRA. They're not getting the debt relief that they require. The compassionate thing to do would be to have a general policy for low-income Canadians who got CERB but weren't eligible of a debt amnesty. That's the compassionate approach, Madam Speaker. But the government refuses to do it and instead insists on this case-by-case approach. Well, let's contrast that with the treatment of companies under the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy Program. As early as December 2020, the Financial Post was reporting that at least 68 companies who got the wage subsidy were paying out dividends to their shareholders. Some of those companies include Imperial Oil and Suncor, who would go on to make record profits. Like, I mean, more profit than they have ever made in their entire history over the course of the pandemic. Do you know how much the government's asked them to repay? $0. Let's talk about the Ottawa Country Club that got the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. That actually ended up having a banner year because they had a way for people to play golf in a socially distanced manner and decided to advance their capital plan to repave their parking lot by about 3 years with the money that they got from the Emergency Wage Subsidy Program. Do you know how much money they've been asked to repay? $0, not a cent. In Edmonton, Sesco Fabrication and Engineering Limited locked out their employees and used the wage subsidy to hire scab labor to come in behind the picket line and perform the work of unionized employees who are exercising their legal and constitutional right to strike. Do you know how much they've been asked to pay back? $0. So why is it that foster kids graduating out of care in Manitoba during a global pandemic who were told by government to apply for the CERB and just did what they were told can't get any compassionate relief policy out of this government, but giant corporations that got money that they weren't entitled to, who then went on to abuse workers or spend the money on a parking lot or pay it out to wealthy shareholders, aren't being pursued by this government in the same way. Where's the fairness in that, Madam Speaker?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What was our government's approach during the pandemic? It was a compassionate, fair, and responsible approach, Madam Speaker.
Tonight, to my colleague, and I've mentioned before the respect I have for him, he continues to raise such matters, as is his right, but he neglects to mention what the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, or the CEWS, a signature pandemic emergency response program, was all about. Yes, wage subsidy support did go to large corporations, but the vast majority of the funds under the program went, in fact, to small businesses, medium-sized businesses as well, but in the main, it was small businesses, mom-and-pop shops, restaurants, retailers, those in manufacturing, entrepreneurs that had started businesses, blood, sweat, and tears put into those businesses. They were the ones getting the support, Madam Speaker. And failing to mention that, I think, takes us down a path that would misunderstand what the CEWS program was all about. It was about keeping employees on the payroll. It was about making sure that those employees who had been laid off as a result of the pandemic could be rehired. And by and large, it was an enormous success. If my colleague is looking for perfection, he will look a long time. There is no perfect policy. But I go back to the fact that in the context of a pandemic, where one had to fly the plane and build it at the same time, so to speak, this proved to be an enormously successful program. And don't only take that from me, Madam Speaker. Talk to the business community. Talk to, and in fact, my friend will note that unions have spoken about the importance of the wage subsidy. Again, not a perfect program, but a program that did help enormous numbers of Canadians, businesses and their employees, by the thousands. In my own community of London, Ontario, I saw that at work. It was quite successful there as well. I continue to be stopped, whether it's on the street or we continue to hear in the constituency office the role that it had. On the CERB, on the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and he hasn't mentioned it here, but the colleague has raised in the past the idea of a blanket CERB amnesty. I get where he's coming from on that. I get where he's coming from on that, but he fails to mention here too that as a general fairness principle, one has to, I think, be very open to the idea, the obligation for the government to ensure eligibility. And that is, in fact, what the Canada Revenue Agency is doing now, going back and ensuring that those who actually received the CERB were eligible for it. If that effort is not made, it really goes against the whole idea of a social safety net. One has to, I think, in principle, always be open to the idea that in order to receive program support under any social safety net, and the CERB is an example of that, one has to be eligible for that. So the government is taking that approach. It is also putting in place an approach that says to those individuals that they have the ability to have a repayment plan offered through the CRA where they can make, if they can't afford to pay lump sums of the amount owing, they can make sure that they have a repayment plan incrementally, whatever they can afford on a monthly basis.
For Elmwood Transcodon?
Well, I think my friend needs a slight history lesson. He'll recall that actually it was the NDP that called for the wage subsidy program in the first place, and the Liberals proposed a 10% wage replacement rate, and New Democrats argued for a 75% replacement rate because we understood that that was an important program. So this isn't to take away from the good work that CEWS did, just as the CERB did a lot of good work. But the difference is, in the case of the wage subsidy, the people who abused it, that shouldn't have got it, and then were big corporations that were making a lot of money. In the case of CERB, there's a whole bunch of people who did abuse that program, who committed identity fraud and other ways of getting that. New Democrats have been very clear that money should be pursued. But for the folks who applied in desperation, who continue to have low incomes, New Democrats believe that compassion has to be shown. Why is there compassion for giant companies and not compassion for the poor?
The honourable member for the Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of National Revenue.
Well, there certainly is compassion for the poor, and I could mention, Madam Speaker, the number of policies that this government has introduced, from the Canada Child Benefit, now the Canada Dental Benefit, the grocery rebate that we've introduced through Budget 2023. But to the substantive point, individuals do have the option of a repayment plan instead of an amnesty program that I know my colleague favors. That is a fair approach. It still ensures eligibility criteria are verified, and if individuals were not in fact eligible, I think the vast majority of Canadians would expect repayment, but they'd also expect a compassionate approach on the part of CRA. That's why if individuals, as I said before, are not able to pay in one lump sum, they can do so on a periodic basis. Again, in setting that up with the CRA, they can find a plan that works for them. Finally, Madam Speaker, an appeals process exists for all cases where an individual is dissatisfied.